Hello, everybody. Welcome once again, and thank you for joining us today, Orange Shirt Day, in recognition of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Today is a day to honor both the survivors and the victims of residential school system. My name is Michael Hart. I'm the Vice-Provost and the Associate Vice President Research for Indigenous Engagement here at the University of Calgary. It's my great honor to be here today to host this panel discussion. This discussion is focused on the unmarked graves, the visit from the Pope, and the path forward. In beginning, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the lands that many of us are situated on, falls within the traditional territories of the peoples of Treaty 7 in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising of Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. We also want to acknowledge that the City of Calgary is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Before we move forward, I think it's important to take a moment to reflect upon the discoveries of the Indigenous children buried in unmarked graves on or adjacent to residential schools across the country. Please join me in a moment of silence to honor and remember the children whose lives were lost and or whose lives and spirits were severely impacted by the residential school system. We remember them. We remember their families and their communities who have suffered from this tragic loss. I would like now to invite Bearspaw Elder Rod Hunter to perform the University of Calgary Honor Song. So, Rod, if you could come up and join us.
Please rise and pick up your shoes. No, I'm just kidding. I dreamt of this song. I woke up singing it in 1979, and I was compelled to give it to the university when we brought Mike in.
Thank you, Rod. We are forever grateful that your drum group, Aihe Nakoda, gifted us this song in 2018. I look forward to the day when the members of the university, whether alumni or current members or even those who want to come here, will join in, learn the song, and sing with Rod. So I encourage you to take that time, and maybe you could even think of it as an act of reconciliation, to learn and to sing the song together. So it brings us together in a good way. I do want to acknowledge that we also share this song at all major institutional events and at our convocation. So it carries deep meaning for us, and it truly is a blessing for us, Rod, that you gifted it to us. To start off our panel discussion in a good way, I'd like to call upon Bigani Elder Reg Crowshoe to offer a smudge and a prayer. So I'm going to pass this to you, Reg.
Okay, it's an honor to open a discussion here today with acknowledging Creator, and we acknowledge Creator or call to order our gatherings by using smudge, and it's important to Indigenous people. I went to a residential school. And I couldn't speak the language or anything like that through the 9 years I was at residential school. But I used to lie in bed thinking about, whoa, can we ever sing our song? Whoa, can we ever speak our language in my lifetime? Even when I left residential school, I used to think, I wonder if we can do these things. But today, it gives me a lot of pride. I'm honored to see so many red or orange shirts for Every Child Matters, to hear the song today also, and our language, our smudge. Whoa, those are things I never thought were possible in my lifetime when I was at residential school. And today is a great day to come to events like this that validates me as a person rather than somebody that was hidden someplace and never talked about. So once you're validated as a person, we can start healing. And that's a big thing for elders to start healing. So with that, I'll acknowledge Creator. O kahe, ai is jipatapio, ai o napi na dos. O kat Christi koye, kam striki no chimakakyawa, nakachimois kanya. O kinaka poato is to see some strisi utayakshi, stui utayaki o kanokwa. Hanikutayak tapa paper, spiawis jipatapio. Ai o makotistapi to chi sawak. Makudi sawa ni ka I koik ni chita peo ka odom ktokpik. Ai stipata peo pa Christi koik ka kwa chimo iskanaka om kita pichi ka isha kina no kaspomo kina. O kap stoke agoxis kato pina kamotan desta wachiman stipata peo sina. O kini tama kamotan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Reg. It's wonderful to have you here with us for this event. Something Reg said touches my heart. It's that phrase, validates me as a person. I thank you for saying those words. Sometimes I don't know how much impact we've had on Indigenous peoples in terms of invalidating them as human beings. And I ask you to carry those words and those thoughts and how they touch your heart, that these actions validate Reg and the many others who attended residential school as a person. Orange Shirt Day is set aside at the beginning of the school year to remember, to shed light on the residential school experience, and to engage in a process of reconciliation through truthing, listening, and learning. The date September 30th was purposefully chosen as it aligns with the time of year when Indigenous children were forcefully taken from their homes to attend residential school. Many of these children did not return home. Many were traumatized for life. And some were brave enough to share their stories. For the second year in a row now, Orange Shirt Day is officially recognized by the Canadian government as the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, reminding Canadians that each one of us carries an important responsibility in the journey towards decolonization and reconciliation, as outlined in the final report on the Truth and Reconciliation. We maintain the name Orange Shirt Day in honor of all the children who, like Phyllis Jack Webstad, whose orange shirt was taken from her, had their dreams taken and replaced with impositions. We recognize that the journey towards meaningful and transformative reconciliation is going to take time and active commitment, requiring good hearts in the hands of many. I would like to thank each and every one of you for joining us today to deepen your understanding of Indigenous peoples' lived experiences and to remember the victims and survivors of residential schools. I encourage you to take what you have learned from today's discussion and engage in meaningful conversations with friends, families, colleagues, even those who may challenge you. This event is one of the first two events offered today from the partnership of the University of Calgary's Office of Indigenous Engagement and the Calgary Public Library. Many thanks to the organizers, and a special welcome to the leaders of the University of Calgary and the Calgary Public Library who are here and able to join us. I have to stress something, and that is the amazing work that has been done behind the scenes by many people. You get to see myself and some other people up front, but the real work has been done by people who help organizing the timing, who help get the stages ready. All of that is part of the commitment they have to making change, and I'm deeply, deeply grateful for all of those who don't get to be up front, and to remember that this isn't just a few people, but it's a great team of people coming together to help us learn, grow, and be better people. Our panelists will each share their own thoughts on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in light of the unmarked graves and the papal apology, as well as our responsibility as Canadians on the path forward. We are deeply honored and extremely grateful to welcome the following panelists: Dr. Cora Voyager, Kathleen Mahoney, and joining us from a pre-recorded discussion, former Chief of the Tsuut'ina Nation, Lee Crowchild. After hearing from each panelist, we hope to have time for live question and answer with our audience. Dr. Cora Voyager earned a Bachelor's of Arts in Sociology, Master's of Education, and Doctor of Philosophy in Sociology from the University of Alberta. She is a member of the Athabasca Chippewan First Nation and a residential school survivor. Cora is currently a full professor of sociology here at the University of Calgary and teaches a variety of criminology and Indigenous courses. She has published 12 books and more than 60 academic articles or book chapters, and her research includes Indigenous women's health, Indigenous women in leadership, Indigenous women in entrepreneurship, and Indigenous women on boards of directors. So, welcome, Cora. I'm glad you're here with us. Also joining us on today's panel is Professor Kathleen Mahoney. She has a Juris Doctor from the University of British Columbia, an LLM degree from Cambridge University, a diploma in International Comparative Human Rights from the Strasbourg International Human Rights Institute in France, and an honorary doctorate from the University of Canada West in Vancouver. She is Emeritus Professor of Law at the University of Calgary and King's Counsel. She was the Chief Negotiator for Canada's Aboriginal Peoples' Claim for Cultural Genocide Against Canada, achieving the largest financial settlement in Canadian history for the mass human rights violations against Indigenous peoples of Canada. She was the primary architect of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and led the negotiations for the historical apology from the Canadian Parliament and from Pope Benedict XVI at the Vatican. The third panelist we have invited to join us is Lee Crowchild. Unfortunately, Lee is unable to attend the event in person, so we arranged to meet him online for a recorded discussion, which we have the pleasure of playing for you shortly. Lee Crowchild is from Tsuut'ina First Nation and is third generation Hakatsi, following in the footsteps of his father and his grandfather, whom the Crowchild Trail in Calgary is named after. He holds a bachelor's degree from Washington State University and was a former chief at Tsuut'ina Nation. In association with the University of Calgary, Lee offered insight and expertise on the adoption of the cultural model designed by Dr. Reg Crowshoe for the University of Calgary's Indigenous strategy. He was one of the cultural advisors to design and construct University of Calgary's Spopie House for the 2011 Solar Decathlon competition and created the winter count drawings for the Spopie House, telling the story of how the home came into being and journeyed to Washington and back. Lee has dedicated his life to serving his community and beyond. I also want to acknowledge, joining us on stage here is Elder Reg Crowshoe, Dr. Crowshoe, who, along with Rose, has been recently, or to be inducted, is it to be inducted, recently to be inducted into the Order of Canada. Me and dates aren't so good. I am so fortunate to be able to spend time with Reg and Rose. They've made me a better human being. And that's saying a lot in terms of how far that journey has to go sometimes. But we're very fortunate as a university to have their guidance, along with the guidance of many universities, on our circle of advisors. Elders like Rod, Doreen Burgeon, who's sitting here with us. There are so many elders that that are here with us. I'm very grateful for the guidance that they provide us, that they give us that oversight and that strength to keep going, because sometimes it just isn't so easy to keep going. And so people like Wallace and Diane, other elders that are here, they give us strength. And when you think about that, after all they've been through, and they're still willing to come here and provide us guidance, we can never give enough thanks, enough appreciation for what they do for us as an institution, as well as for all of us, because ultimately they're touching all of us. So I thank you, Reg and Rose, and all the elders on the circle of advisors. Now, where was I? I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Calgary values the parallel process of cultural protocol, including gifting and honoraria. I have tobacco and broadcloth here that I'll be providing to each of the speakers at today's events. To start off the panel discussion, let's turn our attention over to our pre-recorded panelist, Lee Crowchild, sharing his thoughts about the Pope's visit this past August and how Canadians could bring their own personal journey towards reconciliation. So I'll pass it to our technicians for the video.
Welcome, Lee. I want to acknowledge your leadership as the former chief of Tsuut'ina Nation and the former candidate in the Assembly First Nations run for Grand Chief in 2021. Firstly, I want to thank you for your interview with the CTV correspondents who are covering the Pope's visit this past August. Your reflective thoughts on the meaning of the Pope's apology, the intergenerational trauma, and the importance of truthing for the future generations were insightful and thought-provoking. So thank you for all that effort. And I know that even beyond that, Lee, you're a constant spokesperson in all the things you're doing, even when you're not intending to. You have such an impactful voice, so I really appreciate that. I know I've learned a lot spending time with you, so I appreciate it very, very much. So given the apology and, of course, the discovery of unmarked graves at the former residential schools, I'm wondering, what do you think is the first step for non-Indigenous Canadians and newcomers to begin their own personal journey towards reconciliation?
Well, that's actually a big question, but I'm going to try and break it down. The discovery of the unmarked graves is just sort of another step in recognizing that we need to kind of start moving forward a little bit more. You know, now it opens the door for what were residential schools about? And as we learn about residential schools, and what happened, we're not learning about natives that went to residential schools. We're learning about what the churches and Christianity imposed and used. And that's the bigger lesson here. Not about learning about natives, but learning about what the churches had done. I think that's a good starting point right there. Because that makes us aware. All of us become informed about, well, this is what I've done. And it's going to make people question some of them, they're going to question their faith. Say, well, that's not how I believe it. And, rightly so, because religions always evolve. But it opens the door for believing, for thinking. Now, I want to make this distinction. What is believing and what is thinking? When you're believing, it doesn't necessarily mean you're thinking about anything. You're just believing what people tell you. You're believing what, in this example, what a church does. You're believing the word of God. You're believing the doctrine of discovery. You're believing the papal bulls that were instituted. And you don't think about that. You just believe in this is what I was told, and that's what I'm going to believe. Education is another reflection of that. In curriculum all across Canada and that, there's no place in there that opens the door for questioning. We don't question. We just spit out what we've been told and we don't think about that. Now, thinking is different, because when you're thinking about why do I believe what I'm being told? You're thinking about what needs to change, and those two are not congruent to each other. They're actually quite opposite in approach. But I think that once you start to ask those questions, then you start to shape what your belief is going to be. I think that what happened with residential schools is wrong, but I don't know what the answer is. Well, nobody knows the answer, but at least you're acknowledging that something didn't happen, or something happened that shouldn't have happened. your question, well, why did that happen? We can't blame those that believe that at that time as much as we want to, because when we do that, we get caught up in anger, and in the end, it sort of paralyzes anybody from doing anything. So, but when we get to this point and say, oh, I kind of figured out for myself, individually, I figured out for myself that this was not right, and this kind of action I wanted to do. Now, there's a starting point right there, because we become more, I wouldn't say more enlightened, but we have the ability to ask questions without fear, because we're all trapped in fear. Those that were not part of residential schools, they didn't know that. They live in fear. I don't want to say the wrong thing because I'm going to offend a Native person, a Native elder. I'm going to offend somebody for saying something out of line. And, you have those that went to residential schools and they're survivors and the offspring who carry this anger. And they're just waiting for somebody to say the wrong thing and they're going to jump all over them. Well, that's counterproductive to anything. So in the old days, what the story I was told by my Blackfoot families and that was this idea of this ceremony called making wolf. And that was when it wasn't about apologies so much. It was about telling the truth of what actually happened in the battle, say between Crees and Blackfoots. They all had to come together and they had to talk the truth, the war lodge. And in that truth telling, everybody was able to make their claims about what their war deeds were. And the other side could verify, yes, that indeed did happen. But here are my war deeds. So everybody kind of talks about what that battle was. And this is where the making wolf part comes in. Because you think about a wolf, it's kind of a noble, we all want to romanticize that, but it's still a wild animal. It cannot be tamed. So either at the end of this whole discussion about the war deeds and that, we either resolve something, we don't need to fight this war anymore. Or, gosh, we got to kind of finish this story. Let's step outside and finish that fight. Regardless of the outcome, the truth was told. So they could be enemies for the next 7 generations if they want to be, but everybody can say that was a true story. What we do with that true story becomes what reconciliation is. So like TSA, truth and reconciliation. Mm-hmm. We have to talk about the truth before we can get to reconciliation. But nowadays, nobody wants to talk about truth. They want to jump over to reconciliation because not everybody, but people are afraid of exposing some truth, some ugly truth, and it hurts. Truth is going to hurt. These stories are very hurtful, and that was evident when the Pope came to Canada.
That really feeds into the other area that I was wondering about is the biggest challenge to bring Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations in Canada in order for all of us to move towards reconciliation. So one of the things I'm hearing is we have to speak our truth and others have to hear the truth. You have to be open to that. Is there anything you could add to that?
Well, I think, like I said, in that ceremony, making wolf, both sides have to tell the truth. Mm-hmm. For yes. Non-natives, they have to tell the truth. Say, I didn't know that happened. I was ignorant to that. That's the truth. You can't make up something that didn't happen. You just say, I didn't know. I really didn't know. But I'm certainly willing to learn more information about what is there. If we're to apply that whole concept into modern day living, everything since the signing of treaty on the prairies to now, everything that was imposed, everything that was given under the government and the churches was steeped in ignorance and racism. Mm-hmm. But two sides to every story. On our non-native side, we had to fight back, but we were all the weapons we knew were taken away from us. The only weapon we had left was our bodies, and we'd use that kind of without shame. And we use what impacts those bodies? Well, it's alcohol, it's drugs, it's sex, it's all of these things that became our weapon of choice because we had nothing else. So in all of that, what that does create, it creates this anger, this prejudice. You know, First Nations cannot be racist because racism is attached to a dominating force, oppressive force. That's not us. But we can certainly be prejudiced, and we're really good at that. You know, those two things need to be talked about. Ignorance, racism, and prejudice. Those are the weapons we're using. Those things need to be laid down. And there's where the truth-telling comes out before we can kind of move forward.
I've looked at that in relation to who has power in order to influence or to implement their stereotypes, their preconceived ideas that's unfounded too often. And so I do find the ability to have that power to implement something or to take something away even is a significant part of all of that. One of the things that has been called on is for the Pope to use his power to rescind the Doctrine of Discovery for the benefit of our audience. I'm wondering if you could briefly speak a little bit about the Doctrine of Discovery and how you understand it, and why do you think it's important for the Pope to rescind it?
Well, the Catholic Church now claims that they don't practice that Doctrine of Discovery. They've kind of moved on to that. Is it true or not? I think maybe they don't practice it, but the impact of what it did and how it influenced all religions is still very strong. You don't have to say I still believe in the Doctrine of Discovery on the church's side, but they do. But it has had an impact everywhere. You look at actions that take place now. In the United States, it's the Make America Great Again. That recipe comes right out of the Doctrine of Discovery. This idea of conquest. In Canada, it was the Freedom Convoy with COVID and that. So it was kind of turning tables on those that were in a position of dominance. Were playing the poor me card next. To justify their actions in that. That's my statement. That's how I see it. So for the Pope to rescind that document, it would have been really important, especially for us on the prairies, because then that lessens the impact of what the Indian Act is, and brings in the talk of under treaty. This is where our discussions need to go. Right now, we're limited by the Indian Act. And even our own people, they confuse the Indian Act with treaty. They're not the same. They are not the same at all. The Indian Act made us wards of the state. And it's all its intention to look after us for the purpose of eventually getting rid of us so they can have our land. So to rescind that would have changed the narrative, the Canadian canon, the Canadian discourse would have changed, because it would have gave power to truth-telling. And in that truth-telling, on the prayers, like I say, it was about treaty. Because we didn't give up anything in treaty. We just said, we're not going to kill you because it's counterproductive to anything, and you're not going to kill us. So on the prairies, we really do try to honor and respect treaty, but it's a tall order. And by not rescinding the Doctrine of Discovery, it keeps it in the place of the Indian Act. You can see how the Canadian government right now, past governments, this present government, and future governments will really be, they'll only do so much, because that Doctrine of Discovery was never rescinded. Because in their own right, they say, no, we're doing things in this Canadian identity, we're doing what's right for those Indians. And just in those words alone, kind of puts us in two different levels, us versus them.
That's how I have an understanding of the Doctrine of Discovery. You said two different levels, and that really fits in terms of are at their level in terms of when the Doctrine of Discovery was put out, and that had to do with the Christian faith and how they see us. And if we're not, then they're allowed to do what they wish. And in my eyes, I see the importance of removing it. I mean, it's shaped law, both in this country and other places, such as the United States. So the importance of that, even if it's symbolic, is really significant. So I'm with you there. I truly appreciate your time, Lee, that you've been able to be here with us and to connect with us. I'm looking forward to seeing the future endeavors of Lee Crowchild, and I have no doubt that you'll continue to be a big impact. So thank you very much for this time and being together.
Okay, I just want to say one last thing in closing to all those that are listening here. I would say don't give up the faith of what you believe, as long as that is based on real critical thinking. We have to be critical thinkers in order to move forward. So if you want to carry on this conversation with me, you're more than welcome to, and we'll take that on. I work with the city of Calgary and the churches under the Common Alliance, the Alliance for the Common Good. And it's all churches, it's all inclusive. I work with Muslims in that because this needs to happen for our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. So don't give up the faith. Fight for what you believe.
With that, I thank you, Lee.
Okay. Have a good day.
Honor to be able to sit with Lee and have that opportunity to talk with him and to listen to him in person. I took to heart that point about thinking critically and the importance of being able to do that. We have a tendency to, I'll say, to assume that the fabricated history of about Indigenous peoples is all that we needed to learn, but we need to question that, and we need to go beyond that. For myself, one of the things that really has helped me to start thinking differently is the opportunity to spend time with elders starting from when I was a younger boy. As I had mentioned the elders on the Circle Advisors, but I also want to acknowledge two other elders here, John and Marcia Cryer, who are also on the Circle of Elders, and through their commitment to our traditions helped me to remember to think critically, to think differently. And so I'm grateful for their presence here as well. I'd like to move towards the rest of the panel and direct my questions to them. So my first one is to Kathleen. So firstly, I want to recognize the significant role you played as the chief negotiator for the Assembly of First Nations for the residential school settlement agreement, laying much of the legal groundwork for the process for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission itself that led not only to compensation, but to release of the final report of the Commission for Truth and Reconciliation. Looking back, what do you feel is the impact of the stories gathered in terms of the Canadian mindset? How is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission different from perhaps similar to perhaps similar to previous reports like the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples?
Okay, that's a mouthful. Thank you. First of all, before I start, I do want to also extend my thanks to the Office of Indigenous Engagement and the Calgary Public Library. I think this is a wonderful event, and to you, Michael, for your efforts. I'm not Indigenous. I have some cred in the sense that I'm married to Phil Fontaine, who is, I think, everybody in this room no doubt would agree, is an Indigenous hero in this country, and I learn from him every day, day in and day out, as well as from people like Reg Crowshoe, Chief Crowshoe, who has honored me with presence in my class. As I teach at the law faculty, he's come and taught in my Indigenous law class, along with, as he calls her, the boss, Rose. And I was also blessed to have his granddaughter, Amelia, in my class, who, she wasn't really a student, she was really the teacher, which gives you some idea of Reg's influence on young people. She was probably the most impressive student I have ever taught in terms of the way in which she conducted herself in the classroom, her deep knowledge of Indigenous law and culture, and also her tremendous respect for her grandfather and her people and herself. I mean, she truly, to use your words, Reg, has been very validated as a person, and I'm sure that you are responsible for that. So I'm very happy to be here and honored to be here. I have an Anishinaabe name that I was given in ceremony, but I hesitate to try and pronounce it. I'll embarrass myself. But I've spent now a number of years, since about 2003 actually, working on the residential school issue from my perspective in law. So to answer your question, what impact has the TRC had, the papal visit and so on, we knew as negotiators working with elders, and I took a lot of guidance as well from Elder Fred Kelly from Manitoba, who's well known throughout the country as a very distinguished elder with deep knowledge of his Ojibwe traditions and religion and spiritual background. But Fred sat with us as negotiators. We were not your typical negotiating team, let me tell you. We were often in a room full of at least 80 lawyers, most of them from very large law firms, all of them white, with the exception of Len Marchand from BC, who's now sitting on the Court of Appeal of British Columbia, wonderful Anishinaabe, or he's not Anishinaabe, he's a West Coast Indigenous person who's sitting on the Court of Appeal of British Columbia. He was involved. But just to show you how the law profession works, and the TRC has addressed that in some respects when it addresses the justice theme, we don't do Indigenous people a very good service as a legal profession. We teach, of course, colonial law, and we train our students to think in terms of colonial law. And this is only beginning now to change. We're now in 2022, and gradually law schools are beginning to realize that there's a huge amount of law that we're not teaching. Because you see, Indigenous peoples, the fact that they existed on this planet and on this continent in particular for thousands of years means, by definition, they must have had a legal order. Otherwise, they would not have survived. No society can survive without laws that regulate behavior and to keep people doing what the society thinks is important and healthy and sustainable for the society. So that there were sophisticated and well thought out laws that were handed down generation to generation in Indigenous communities. But when the British and the French came to this country and took over as the founders, which is also a misnomer of Canada, they ignored Indigenous law. So the BNA Act, our first constitution, which is the supreme law of this country, along with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, immortalized the British and the French culture, languages, laws, and what else did it do? It confined Indigenous people to be subjects of the government that would be forever controlled by the bureaucracy of Canada under the Indian Act. That's the way in which this lack of recognition of the reality of Indigenous peoples, the reality that they existed in law, with their laws and their practices, it was ignored. And as a consequence of that, we ended up with where we are today. And the papal bull, I'll address that in a few minutes if you want me to, but that played into that as well. So the legal profession, the way we teach, the way we practice, the way we set up our courtrooms, the way we dispense punishment, the way we try to deter people, it doesn't include a huge amount of extremely valuable laws and information that would enhance our legal system. And that's been proven as we have made some progress in this area. I just give a shout out to University of Victoria, who have in their faculty of law now, they provide 2 degrees to their law students, a degree in colonial British/French influence law and a degree in Indigenous law, so that they're now graduating students who will be able to bring to judges a different perspective, and they'll be able to say, well, this is the way Anishinaabe or Cree or West Coast laws would have addressed this particular family law problem or criminal law problem or land use problem. And so I've been lucky to be at the forefront of some of that in teaching Indigenous law, and we have Professor Brian Calliou here, who took over after me and is now teaching that course in the law faculty. So our faculty is making some baby steps. In my opinion, not enough, but nevertheless, as we all know, change tends to be very incremental and slow, but we are in that realm of recognition, I think, at least to some extent. So the TRC, well, the calls to action, I think it should be really understood, and probably most of you already understand this, but the calls to action address systemic issues. We've had human rights commissions in this country for many years. The problem with human rights commissions is that they only deal with individual acts of discrimination. So if one bad person hurts another person through their racist or discriminatory or misogynistic or homophobic behavior, the person who's on the receiving end of that gets to take it before a human rights commission. But it doesn't address, the Human Rights Commission can't address homophobia or racism or misogyny in a general way in society. So every person that suffers that kind of treatment individually has the responsibility to file their case before the commission and get their lawyer and get their evidence. So you can see how it's not very effective. So I was talking about systemic discrimination versus individual discrimination. So the TRC is addressing systemic discrimination, and that takes, it's like moving the Titanic. It takes quite a while to change systems, right? So the justice system, the healthcare system, the education system, the private sector, the world of sport, all of those issues are addressed in the TRC. So when you read them, you have to think of them in that way, that if you have a role to play, or if you're in a position of influence or power in those fields, you have to look at how we systemically treat Indigenous peoples, and can we change that? So here at the university, I'll give you our examples. We've done some wonderful things, I think, in the last few years, because we've addressed how universities as a whole systemically have discriminated against Indigenous people. So we have to look at our hiring practices. We have to look at our curriculum. We have to look at our scholarships and prizes. We have to look at our admission criteria. We have to look at our faculty and see, are we representing Indigenous people? Are we treating them fairly? Are we reflecting their reality and what we're teaching the generations of students coming through this institution? And I think there's been quite a few changes made, and the people here that know that better than me are our president, Macaulay, and Michael Hart, vice president of Indigenous Affairs. They're working very diligently on trying to change this system that all of us are engaged in as students and faculty members and staff members and so on. So I think the TRC, to answer your question, Michael, if it continues in the way it has with an example like the university, we will see fundamental change over time, and for the better, because it will show an awareness and a willingness and a participatory activities within institutions to change their ways. And the justice portfolio in particular, because that's where I'm coming from, the 94 calls to action asks the justice system to look at the education of lawyers and judges. And it's saying that we should be cognizant of how limited our legal education is, and that we should include in the way we teach our law students information and teachings about Indian residential schools, teachings about treaties, teachings about racial discrimination, systemic discrimination, and the like. And we also, the 94 calls to action asks a government to rethink Limitations Act. Now that probably doesn't ring familiar to a lot of you here, but what Limitations Acts are statutes that say if you don't take your legal action within a certain period of time, you're finished. You can't take it. And usually those limitation periods are quite limited, about 6 years. Some are even shorter than that. Well, when you look at the Indigenous context and limitation acts, usually these land grabs or theft of land or failure to adhere to treaties occurred many years ago, centuries ago in some cases, decades ago in others. Now, there's a case I'm working on right now where there was an illegal amalgamation in 1873. Well, the Indian Act, which was passed a few years later, says that Indigenous people could not hire lawyers to fight land claims. And in our case, what happened was our clients' reserve and their community was illegally amalgamated with another, and their land was taken away. But they went to hire a lawyer in the early 30s and 20s, and the government wrote to the lawyer and said, you will be disbarred if you continue to act for this community. So not only were they forced into poverty because of this amalgamation, but they were prohibited from hiring lawyers to fight for their land back so that they could have an economic base. Those are some of the things that have occurred in law over the years. So one of the calls to action is to get rid of these limitations acts so that First Nations can bring their cases in 2022 before the courts when we have a deeper and better understanding of human rights and the appropriate way to act in terms of race and all these other things that we've learned over decades, that to shine the light of present day on these violations and deal with them. So that's another key element of the 94 calls to action. Another one is dealing with the incredibly over-representation of Indigenous peoples in our prisons, both male and female prisoners. They're incredibly disproportionately represented in these institutions. In Saskatchewan, for example, my understanding is over 80% of the prisoners in that province are Indigenous, and yet they make up about 10% of the population of Saskatchewan. So there's been efforts now under the 94 calls to action, to address this issue, to address the things like mandatory minimum sentences, where if you do something, maybe a break and enter, or maybe an assault, or something like that, the government had implemented mandatory minimums, so a judge couldn't sentence somebody less than a certain number of years in jail. So the courts have decided and are now moving better in a direction to take into account the reality of Indigenous peoples when sentencing, opportunities to divert them away from prisons and into other methods of dealing with their crimes, often on reserve with elders and so on, to hand over some of that corrective work to be done by the Indigenous communities themselves. So that's another impact. I think that's very, very important. I'll just mention another one that's really important. You probably remember the case in Saskatchewan where a young Indigenous boy was shot in the head by a farmer because he was trespassing on his land. Instead of asking or calling the authorities or whatever to tell these boys and their friends, boy and girl, I think 3 boys and a girl, to leave his property, the farmer took the law into his own hands and shot the young man through the window of the car and killed him. Then the farmer was charged with murder, and then it went to trial, and there was a jury trial. Well, our jury selection system is also systemically flawed, such that a lawyer can pick a jury by dismissing certain candidates without cause, which means you don't have to give a reason why you're not picking this one or that one that's come before the court. So what ended up in the Colton Bushy trial was that it was a jury of all white people, not one Indigenous representative there, and yet the place where the offense took place, the majority of the people living in that area were Indigenous. And the farmer was acquitted. So, there's been efforts now to change the jury system, and some changes have been made. But that's another example of systemic problems within the legal system. My opinion on the Pope visit was that, and the reason he came to Canada, I think, the thing that really triggered the Canadian visit was the unmarked graves discovery in Kamloops. I think up until that time, Canadians sort of knew what was going on with the report of the Truth Commission, but if any of you have studied it, you know that there's 3 huge volumes. So it became something for academics and students and others particularly interested to be familiar with. So it was no surprise when these graves were discovered for people that had read the report, but most Canadians hadn't done that. And I think when this news broke in Kamloops, I think what that made all non-Indigenous people do was sit up straight and say, whoa, what happened? Is that really what Canada did to our Indigenous population? And I think people internalized that reality, people including the Catholic Church. And so I think the Canadian Council of Catholic Bishops were moved to say to the Holy Father that, yes, it's time to come to Canada. And they managed his trip. And what was really interesting, in my opinion, of the Pope's visit is something about telling the truth. Because you see, he came here, he landed here in Alberta, Massachusetts, and the first visit was there. He heard from survivors there. After that, he went up to the lake, what's it called? Lac Sainte Anne. He heard from survivors there. He went across the country to Quebec City. He heard from survivors there, and then up to Nunavut. So people told the Pope the truth in small settings, much smaller than this actually, and told them their stories. And so if you notice, and if you followed his visit across Canada, he changed each time. He, first of all, didn't mention sexual assault as being part of the residential school experience. By the time he got to Quebec City, he was talking about sexual assault. He didn't mention at all the papal bulls, nor did he mention the word genocide. But notice as he was leaving the country and all of the people who surrounded him, all his advisors and so on, that no doubt were advising him what to say and what not to say, they weren't surrounding him to that extent. On the plane on the way back to Rome, he said, yes, it was genocide. So he learned as he went, and he said it can't be called anything else. So that's the importance of truth-telling. And it even affected one of the most powerful people on the face of the earth, who is the Pope of the Catholic Church. There's something like 400 million Catholics around the globe, and he's the top of that structure. So I think truth-telling is critical. We knew negotiating the Indian residential school settlement, as I said, that the legacy piece would be the TRC. Money comes and goes, and it was important to compensate people. There's no doubt about that, because that shows that there's a recognition that harm has been done and people are entitled to some form of compensation. And that happened. There was over $6 billion in compensation paid out. But that, as I say, comes and goes. But the Truth Commission and its 94 calls to action, that will not go. That will stay. The reforms that are taking place now will continue to evolve. I'm not desperately depressed about the speed. I mean, when you look at the 94 calls to action, they are divided between 3 levels of government and the private sector. So there's lots of bureaucrats in between, what needs to be done. There's lots of private interests and so on, but changes are happening. My husband, for example, works as a top advisor to RBC. RBC's made enormous advances in what they do and how they do it. He's also on a board of advisors and Indigenous Advisor Committee for CN. CN runs through hundreds of Indigenous communities across the country. And before they just ignored the Indigenous reality, but now they're starting to change. The Law Society has made it mandatory for lawyers to learn about Indigenous culture and their history and the residential school reality. So those are just some examples that I happen to know about, and as well as the university, which I've already talked about. So
thank you.
It's made an impact, Michael, I think, and we shall hopefully continue on that path.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your... I think I have to be in agreement with you, or else I couldn't do what I'm doing, that we are making impact and in making changes. In terms of Canadian mindset, I would acknowledge, though, that it's possible for people that aren't impacted to make a decision to walk away, and that often happens in really small incremental ways. And the reason I say that is because it's something that's in our work here at the university. It's us as citizens in this country that all those little choices add up. And so at the times when we want to say, oh, maybe later, those are key times to keep moving, for us to keep contributing and contributing to creating the change and transformation that we're looking for within the university here and beyond. So I do note that sometimes things wane, but hopefully with events like this, statements such as you're sharing, the guidance of the elders, that will keep moving forward in a really good way to transform the institution. I want to move to you, Cora, and I first want to acknowledge your accomplished academic career, because it's quite remarkable. Your long-standing service to our communities through Indigenous research in the field of sociology. I also want to invite people to review your very personal story in You Today. And so thank you so much for sharing that with us. This was published this past August. It was about that papal visit. So as an individual who's attended residential school, what were your thoughts on the papal visit and the specific events, the significance of the sites visited, and the impact of the apology that was offered?
Okay. I'd like to just kind of make a few comments here on what was said earlier. Thank you, Kathleen, for mentioning the Law Society of Alberta and the move that they made to have lawyers and learn about and have a mandatory curriculum. Until last November, I was a lay bencher on the Law Society of Alberta, and I worked on and developed that curriculum. And it was a tough slog. You know, there was pushback, and you know, I really had to stand my ground on that and said, you know what, if not now, when? You know, you're talking about truth and reconciliation, let's do it now. So anyway, there was, you know, comments about, oh, how much is it going to cost? How much does it cost to have Indigenous people in the justice system? How much does that cost to, you know, the society in general, but also to the families of these Indigenous people? Right now, I teach a class called Indigenous People and the Justice System. And what I talk about is the criminalization of the Indigenous lifestyle. And it's not just a matter of counting noses and all of this kind of stuff. What is it that causes Indigenous people to be so over-involved in the justice system? And there is systemic issues, and it starts with the police. It starts with the police. So if we could have, you know, this type of curriculum for people that become police officers, and with the PATH, which is the name of this curriculum for lawyers, the thing that I was really adamant about is that students become lawyers and lawyers become judges. So you can see how that path progresses. And it's the judges that are putting people in prison. So they need to know about the history of Canada. They need to know, you know, the history. And, you know, the history of Indigenous people is a dark history. And it's not something that people are excited to hear. I mean, people feel shamed. They feel guilty. They feel like they're being blamed for the history that we have. And we don't have to like our history. We just have to know it. We have to know it, and we have to acknowledge it. So I was at the first, let me back this up. I am part of a group called the Indian Residential School Survivors Circle. And we met, and Phil was there in May in Winnipeg, where we drafted an apology. And we drafted this apology and said, this is what we want to hear from the Pope. So we were very bold about that, you know, the 5 parts to an apology, you know, acknowledging that things happen, saying you're sorry, you know, saying that we've harmed you, it'll never happen again, and you know, those 5 parts. So we drafted that, and we gave it to the Congress of Catholic Bishops. And then we waited to see what was happening. And what we did was we spelled out each of the abuses: sexual abuse, emotional abuse, cultural abuse, physical abuse that was suffered by the children in these residential schools. And when I was at Musqueam, this was the first stop on a number of visits by the Pope. It was not mentioned. You know, we're sitting there, and mentally I've got this little, ticking the boxes. Yeah, he said this. Yes, he said that. And then he starts talking about the abuses. Okay, physical abuse, emotional abuse, cultural abuse. And I'm thinking, and he didn't say it. He didn't say it. And I'm like, come on, buddy. Anyway, that didn't happen. But the other thing was that we wanted specifically for him to say, I apologize to you on behalf of the Catholic Church. And that did not happen either. So in my mind, the fact that he was kind of, gaining steam and gaining momentum as, throughout these different venues, the one that I was at, I didn't feel he ticked all the boxes for me. So I am teaching, as I mentioned, Indigenous people in the justice system. And what I have my students doing is we're going through Kent Roach's book about the Stanley trial. So I have groups of students that are doing a chapter each to talk about what happened through all of this. And the funny thing that I found about this case when it was going on is that it was called the Colton Bushy case. And it's not the Colton Bushy case, it's the Gerald Stanley case. And the fact that, and we know that, in the prairies in Canada, that there's a tremendous amount of racism. And the fact that, the police officers would go to tell a mother that her son is dead, she's got his food in the microwave waiting for her son to come home so she can heat it up for him. And she's waiting, he's not coming. And the police officer smells her breath to see whether she's been drinking. When, she collapses to the floor because her son is dead, the police officer tells her to pull herself together. Now, what the hell is going on in a country where, a whole, couple cars of police officers come out with their pistols drawn and surround a house where they're coming to tell somebody that their child has died? So again, there is a whole lot of, real ugly racist stuff going on. And this is what happened to Colton Bushy. And we also know that Gerald Stanley wrote a book and was shopping it around for a publisher. And we have a law in Canada that says that you can't benefit from a crime. So, having said that, when we talk about the papal bulls, we're actually talking about two papal bulls. One is the Doctrine of Discovery, which was in 1493. It's called Inter Caetera, which said that the Spanish had all of the rights to the land, all the trade, west of a demarcation line, which was 100 leagues west of the Azores and Cape Verde Islands. So this line was moved by various treaties and whatnot. So that was the first one. The second one, which was more specific to the Christianization of First Nation people, was one called Sublimis Deus. And this is in 1537, and this is Pope Paul III. And what brought this about was there, had been movement back and forth across the ocean, and the explorers came back to Europe and said, there are these brown people running around there. We don't know whether they're human or not. And the Pope said, yes, they are human. And because they are human, that means that they have souls. And of course, this is where all the Christianization started. So it is quite, when we think about colonization in Canada, it comes from a position of racism and a position of superiority. And the idea that we as First Nation people, had to be saved by the whites. In my region, I come from northeastern Alberta, a little isolated community called Fort Chipewyan. It's the oldest European settlement in Alberta, and it was established in 1788. However, my historical record and the historical record of my people goes back 13,000 years. 13,000 years. So when the Europeans came over, they didn't bring organization to us. They didn't bring God to us. They didn't bring law to us. We already had that. And it was through this notion of superiority and the infantilization of the people that the colonizers find there. And this has happened to every group of people that have been colonized around the world. So, with regard to the papal visit, there was quite a lot of chatter, for lack of a better word, about one of the former commissioners, Wilton Littlechild, giving the Pope a headdress. People were screaming and ki-eyeing about it, saying, how could you do that? How could you give, honor the Pope and whatnot? But I didn't see it that way. I saw it as us taking back our power. They tried to take our religion away, they tried to take our culture away, and this was Wilton Littlechild saying, here you go, now we're in control in this situation. And there were a lot of Indigenous people that were very angry with Wilton, and I remember seeing something on Facebook, and I had to stop reading it because it was so vile. And he is a great man, and he has given a great amount of service to the Indigenous community, as have Murray Sinclair. I mean, sincerely, they have really been angels in our community and have really, really moved the dial. And when I was asked about this, because I was speaking on CBC on the noon show, and I said to them, we're on their territory. They're the organizers. They get to call the tune. If people don't like it, tough. They're our hosts. We're on their territory. They get to make the rules. So there was, some real disappointment that there had been a number of invitations for the Pope to go to British Columbia, to Kamloops, and those were not taken up. Actually, I was in Kamloops last year for the first Orange Shirt Day, and was very disappointed that our Prime Minister chose not to, we saw him, well, we didn't see him, but, he was flying over us in his plane to go to the West Coast. But that was a disappointment, and I was disappointed again that the Pope chose not to go to Kamloops. That would have been a real gracious thing to do in my mind. And speaking to the discovery in BC, this was not news to the Indigenous community. Everybody knew that this was happening. But what did happen there was that there was validation given to the people who had been saying this all along. I mean, it would be hard to go into the Indigenous community and not find somebody who knows someone who has had a family member or a community member who did not come back from residential school. In my community, we had a residential school for 100 years, from 1874 to 1974. So we had generations of families going through the system. And, as Kathleen mentioned, the fact that there's a cemetery next to a school, that's just all kinds of wrong. So, and that's something that, we as a country have to come to grips with. So, I hope I answered that question.
Thank you very much, Cora. I was just thinking about your last statement. Can you imagine if we had a cemetery next to the university here? So if you want to bring that home, reflect on that. And then reflect on that if we lose anybody, we don't tell anyone. So this is a kind of critical thinking demonstrated by our panelists, set up for us by our elders. This is the kind of critical thinking I encourage us to engage in so that you could bring it home, because it's from our heart where we're going to make the greatest impact and change. I'd like to take some time for questions and answers. We have Reg joining us here and our panelists who are able to take on questions that you may ask. So if you have any, please feel free. I lost my spot. So please feel free to step forward. We have someone with a mic here. If you have any questions you'd ask, either about any of the things that are shared here or any other topics, please. Our distinguished guest. Yes.
I'm Professor Catherine.
While we're waiting, I just want to say one thing. Kathleen and I have a manuscript at a publisher right now that deals with truth and reconciliation commissions around the world. So if everything goes right, it will get published eventually. So you can watch for that.
Thank you. I'm Professor Catherine Odora-Hoffers from Uganda, and I worked in South Africa for 20 years, and I've seen evil, really. You know what South Africa went through. Mm-hmm. Now, my question is to both of you. I haven't read the TRC report myself. Can you brief me whether it is just on the residential schools only, or is there any systemic issues about colonialism itself, the violence of colonialism itself?
Excellent question. Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, go ahead.
Excellent question. Yes, I mean, it's probably one of the best history books that's been written in this country about Indigenous peoples. It's about, what is it, 6,000 pages, I think, at least. So it's a very, very detailed history of colonization in Canada and how the schools, it's supposed to focus on residential schools, but it goes far broader than that. And it talks about, everything from point of contact forward. And what's really interesting, and I think a lot of people don't necessarily know, is that at Contact, the Indigenous people wanted education. They said they wanted to learn the cunning of the white man because they could see what was coming with the settlers and this huge amount of people looking for new homes. And so they wanted education, but they wanted education that would preserve their own ideals and their own culture. They didn't want themselves to be wiped out as Indigenous peoples and turned into white people, assimilated. So it talks about that. It talks about the history of the schools. It talks about what was going on at the time in government and what the political culture was like, how Canada borrowed from other countries. They're dealing with the Indian problem, so-called, and in fact, there was a man called Davin who was given the responsibility by the federal government to go down to the US and see what they were doing about their Indigenous population. And they were putting children in schools called industrial schools at the time. And so he brought those ideas back to Canada, back to Parliament, And that was the first attempt at assimilation was industrial schools. Didn't work. But then residential schools evolved out of that because they felt that and in fact, there's a famous quote by the Prime Minister of the time, John A. Macdonald, basically saying that these people are savages. If we don't take them away from their savage parents and their savage communities, they will continue to be savages, only they'll know how to read and write. So I'm not quoting it exactly, but essentially that's what he said. And so that's when the idea came, well, we have to separate these children. We have to get them out of their communities, break that bond with their parental influence, break the bond with the community. And indeed, that's what happened to so many people, and we're experiencing that damage to this day. So that was kind of how it evolved. And the TRC report goes into all of that in quite a bit of detail. They talk about the deaths in the schools. The report itself estimates that there were 6,000 children died in the schools, mainly from disease, from tuberculosis. There was another fellow that was assigned, he was the medical doctor, and his job was to advise the government on the state of health in Indian residential schools. And he did a tour around, and he discovered that in some of the schools, 50% of the students were dying, particularly out in British Columbia. And the reason, a lot of the reason for that, one of them was funding. The funding was on a per capita basis. So if you were running a residential school, you got money from the government on the number of children, based on the number of children that were enrolled. So there was an incentive, of course, to bring in as many kids as possible because the schools were underfunded consistently by Canada. So the people running the schools, mainly the Catholic Church people, would bring in more kids. And there would be sick kids in the school already, and they'd bring in healthy kids, and they would get tuberculosis as well. So the vast number of deaths in the schools was as a result of that tuberculosis plague that existed in Canada for quite a few years in the 20s and 30s. So that's all documented in the TRC. That's why Cora and I were both saying this was not news to anybody. People knew. Now, in addition to TB, there were other kids that tried to run away. That in my husband's school, there were 2 boys, that was quite a known story, that ran away from the school. They stole the boat, fashioned some kind of sail to sail across the Winnipeg River, and capsized. And so they died. But, you know, the TRC goes into goes into specific stories as well as the general systemic reality. So it's an extremely valuable document.
What I would say about in terms of the colonization, the TRC does address a number of things, but colonialism is still here. And there's a number of things that it shows itself. We still have an Indian Act. It's still present in our institutions. It's present in terms of who gets to decide what's going to happen for Indigenous peoples. Is it ourselves or not? And so those are some very basic things to reflect. I do want to give one brief moment for Cora, and we also have a question from an elder, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay. Another, just to tag on to what Kathleen said, prior to the Davin Report in 1879, there was another report called the Bago Report from 1844 that also said the same thing. So there were those 2 reports, and they just kind of laid the foundation. You know, if it's working in the U.S., it'll work here. And again, you know, the incentivization of, you know, getting as many children as you can, because it was kind of a, money per person. The report that Kathleen talked about from the doctor was Peter Bryce. And when he made his report to the government, to the House of Commons, he was promptly fired for his efforts, saying that, you know, things were really bad. And, you know, they also, what he talked about was like the numbers, they're saying, you know, 4,000 to 6,000, and we know that we're still going through that process. But what also happened with some of the children is that they were very sick and they were sent home and they died at home. So those individuals were not part of the count. And I know that, tuberculosis was very rampant. My aunt and her friend Terry Coudray were sent down to Edmonton because they had both contracted tuberculosis. Terry died when she was in Edmonton, and her family still does not know where her body is, don't know where it is. And actually, when I was in residential school, I also tested positive for TB. So anyway, it was something that was, very, very prevalent and very long-standing within the residential schools.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
We have one last comment.
Thank you. Just recently, we
You can yell it out. Use your teacher voice.
Just recently, we had we had our own presentation of the Constitution, and it wasn't passed. It wasn't approved. And so one of the questions that was asked is, well, what is this Constitution, and how do we interpret it into into our own language and our own concept? And so, but I also asked, because part of this is the human rights that is included, and so my encouragement with the in a community is that we develop our own human rights, because my suspicion is the human rights is based on colonial mentality. And so I thought that if we had our own human rights recognized, and so now that I'm listening also, is that is colonial case law valid in light of the new mentality, or light of recognition of the Indigenous, pre-settlement law? So.
If I can just answer that. There was a Indigenous branch of the Human Rights Commission back, I believe, in the mid-90s, and there was a little pamphlet or something that talked about Indigenous human rights. So that was under Muriel Stanley Van, and she had other people working on it. Brian, you worked on that, didn't you, the human rights? Yeah.
I would just add to that John Burroughs, who's now a world-famous Indigenous law professor, has written a book called Indigenous Constitution, and he sets out there what an Indigenous Constitution could look like. And he tackles that very, very tricky question, which is how would Indigenous law and Canadian law interact and harmonize? And because, there's all sorts of questions of sovereignty and what the rule of law and so on and so forth, which pose very difficult problems in terms of two bodies of law, one that has been unrecognized. So Professor Burroughs talks about that extensively, and I'd highly recommend that text. He writes in a very accessible way as well, so it's not like you're plowing through some legalese that's hard to understand. And this is what they're working on as well at the University of Victoria. They're looking on ways in which Indigenous law can, number one, be found and identified, because it's been gone for so long in many communities that it needs to be revived. And so they're doing this through discussions with elders, analyzing songs and stories, and bringing these values and these principles and these rules forward. So now, for example, there's a Cree code of law that's been written by the Indigenous Bar Association. So things are moving in that direction, and you're perfectly correct to identify human rights as being an area which is not very inclusive of Indigenous values and realities, and there's a lot more. In fact, our system, our mainstream system of law, could learn so much from Indigenous values and the way in which problems are solved that could be incorporated. So Professor Burroughs, his fame and his notoriety around the world as being this incredible Indigenous scholar, has been trying to figure out ways in which these laws could be harmonized and both benefit from the use, as opposed to separate and distinct areas of law, which causes just a whole bunch of problems, as you can well imagine, in terms of you know, all sorts of communities that are intermingled, marriages, et cetera, et cetera. So laws have to apply, you know, you have to know who they apply to and how they apply. So harmonization, I think, that's my opinion in any event, is the key to going forward.
We've been fortunate to have John present, and I'm sure that we would welcome him back again. We have to wrap up the Q&A now, and I wanted to thank you all. We did get a chance to hear from Reg. I do hope that we'll take the time, both in coming events, but also if you have the chance to speak with Reg and Rose. Reg is I don't know, even a walking university. And in terms of being able to speak up regarding Indigenous rights, Indigenous law, I have expanded my basic limited understanding of it by listening to Reg, concepts such as the parallel path and the importance of that to bring that forward. There's so much to gain. So if you have a chance to speak with Reg and Rose, I encourage that, as well as the other elders that are here. With that, I want to take a moment to note that the impact of residential school system is a difficult subject to talk about, and it can bring up a lot of unexpected feelings. So I do encourage you, if there's anyone you need to speak to take that time for yourself, because it should be something that helps us move forward, not something that weighs us down to such a degree that we can't make transformation and better change. We will be sending out an email in the coming days that will have support resources, so please know that will be made available. I encourage you not to forget to join us at the Calgary Public Library screening of Night Raiders this evening at 6:30 p.m. The screening is free to the public, and it's taking place at downtown at the Central Library. To help conclude this event, I invite two very special guests to provide some reflective remarks. Melissa, is Melissa here? Oh, right in front of me. Melissa is the Director of Visitor Experience with the Calgary Public Library. So I would like to invite Melissa to join us, and then I'll invite our University President right after that, Ed McCauley, to also speak.
Thank you, and hello everyone. I'm Melissa Legacy, Director of Visitor Experience at Calgary Public Library. CEO Sarah Meilleur wishes she could be here and sends her regrets. Thank you to the panelists today for sharing your insights and experiences. I learned a lot. Thank you. Libraries have an important role to play in truth and reconciliation, and we are so grateful that we could be part of today's Orange Shirt Day programming. Calgary Public Library takes providing access to truth through information and resources like today's event very seriously as part of our commitment to truth and reconciliation as an organization. On behalf of the library, thank you for the opportunity to be part of today's conversation.
Good afternoon. Today is a day of reflection, and a very, very important day. Reflection of the trauma caused by residential schools, the loss of culture, the loss of language, the loss of childhood, and the loss of family. Reflection on the impact of the mass graves we still discover into the present. And the University of Calgary is closed today to encourage students, faculty, and staff to reflect, and also to learn. And this panel has actually been remarkable in terms of educating us. In partnership with the Calgary Public Library, the Office of Indigenous Engagement will deliver joint programming today in keeping with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call for educational institutions to take leadership roles in reconciliation. And the University of Calgary is deeply committed to accepting responsibility for truth and reconciliation. Moving in parallel paths in a good way, guided by a Tapatope, reimagining ways of knowing, connecting, and being. My gifted name is Black Squirrel, and Rod has to explain to me why it's actually so appropriate when I see them running around on campus. But in 3 years ago, in a very, very powerful ceremony, Reg Crowshoe painted my face and gave me the responsibility of implementing our Atapatope strategy, and it's a responsibility I take very, very seriously. And our Indigenous strategy began 5 years ago, and I really want to thank the elders who are in this room and not in this room for helping University of Calgary develop our symbolic strategy, which is really quite unique in the country. And also I want to give a major shout out to our former Provost and Vice President Academic, Drew Marshall, and many of the people that are in this room from the university staff that were intimately engaged day in and day out to making sure that this strategy is the best it can be for us to move forward in a good way on a journey. We have been making progress, Kathleen, in a variety of areas. Over the time since 5 years ago this strategy was actually created, we've committed and supporting 21 projects through the Intercultural Grant Program. We are honored to be guided by elders who are embedded in faculties, departments, and administrative units to help us on our journey of reconciliation and transformation. The University of Calgary's Elders Teaching Series focuses on traditional knowledge, lived experiences, and Indigenous ways of knowing and connecting. And in 2 virtual events this year, it has often offered oral teachings and reflections from elders living in the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta. We cannot move together towards reconciliation without learning about and reflecting upon the lived experience of Indigenous peoples. As you walk across campus, I hope you see some of the flags that are out there that really reflect the values of an entrepreneurial university. Start something, create something, discover something. And we are doing that now in parallel paths, walking together. And I'll give you 2 examples, and especially one on disrupt something. The University of Calgary could choose to submit only one major proposal for a very big national grant competition. And our choice was One Child, Every Child. And it was led by Michael Hart and our colleagues from the Alberta Children's Hospital Research Institute and the Cummings School of Medicine, but contributions from faculties across our campus. And it was this notion of One Child, Every Child, for us, by us. And Michael, thank you so much for your work on this. It is taken, when we presented it, Michael presented it in Ottawa, it's just amazing the transformation it had in terms of the discussions in Ottawa about Indigenous community health. So thank you, Michael. The second one, which is kind of interesting in terms of disrupting something, is that, it takes a lot, Kathleen, to move institutions, especially some governmental institutions. But this year, or Bill Galley will correct me, but last year, we actually submitted a proposal to the Social Science and Humanities Research Council by a professor in social work that was in Cree. This caused a ripple through Ottawa, which now I think will ripple across the country, because the Social Science and Humanities Research Council has agreed to review this proposal in Cree. So again, this is how we can disrupt something, and we can make the future a different place. And it's only natural that universities play a lead role in this learning, and the University of Calgary will continue to do so today and every day as we recommit ourselves to meaningful and lasting reconciliation. And I also want to give a special thanks to Reg for leading us today in the teepee ceremony and cleansing us, and I really, really appreciate it, Reg, all you do for us. Thank you.
I'm sorry. There's.
Maybe I can answer this very quickly. It had to do with ventilation. The schools, for the most part, were sealed. They were in areas where there was cold weather, and once the virus got in, it circulated very quickly. So that was.
This is a really good question that you could raise and bring forward to some of the panelists, and so yes.
Yeah.
What?
You're welcome to talk with the panelists or others that are here right after. So we're just going to finish up, and then we could continue with the discussion. Okay. With that said, I'm going to ask Rod if he could join us to help us finish off this part of the day with a song.
I'm going to sing I Want to Heal song. I want to live is the words, but it's a healing song that was bestowed upon me from a good friend of mine from the United States. He's also a Dakota, and he's not doing so well. He's in hospital, so I'm going to sing for him to heal, and for everybody to heal here. After Reg purified us, I feel wonderful. Nimbe wachingeno yo, Nimbe wachingeno yo, Nimbe wachingeno ahe yo, wakatanga Nimbe wachingeno yo, wakatanga Nimbe wachingeno ahelo Nimbe wachingeno yo, Nimbe wachingeno yo, Nimbe wachingeno ahelo wakatanga Nimbe wachingeno yo, wakatanga Nimbe wachingeno ahelo.
Yes. Thank you. I'd ask Reg if you would come and do a closing prayer for us, please.
Okay. It's been an honor and a lot of knowledge we've talked about today, and I'm so glad that we're able to start these discussions. I think as we move ahead, we need more discussions. One of the things that I look at is how do we don't impose on each other? How do we travel in parallel paths so that we can look at those parallels to be the best practices to move ahead between oral and written practices? We don't want to be saying oral versus written. We want to say oral and or written, because it's those parallels we do find that are going to build the best practices to take on challenges today, like reconciliation. So with that, I just want to acknowledge Creator for a safe trip home for everybody. Oh, kahe, ay chipatapio. Ayo napi natus. Oh, kitad's kachibata Christikoik. Ay spomoki na nakhe. Anekchi damagis tchi, pues binana negda kutapa pay, pues binan. Oh, kem steki makapim skatos hawan Christikoik. Hanikochi och chip, hanikodom chtay, pues, hanidom chtay krimpstania. Ay spomo samaki damwakapim skatosa. Hagochiti iskrinimiawanik isochtik machochbuksukapo takimaksani chetapiwak. Ay chipatapiwak hagochiskatumoya kamutan nesto wachiman achipatapiwak. Sinanyay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us and your presence and the opportunity to learn I encourage you to keep learning. This isn't all going to happen now. It's going to happen as we keep moving forward together. So, Kananas Commit now.